I was just going to share my homemade spring compressor for drums and transmissions. I made this probably close to 20 years ago now. I used to, when I first did my first couple transmissions, I tried to do it with, well, here, let me tell you, what your objective is going to be is always, there's almost always in these drums some form of a retainer, which is what this is right here. And then you'll have either a pack of coils, pack of little tiny springs for return springs, or you'll have this, like it's got a big coil spring under it, or a Belleville spring. But and then you got to compress that and then put a snap ring on it to retain it. And then when you're tearing down, you've got to compress it enough to get room to get the snap ring off. But the concept is simple. Back when I made this, the store-bought ones were pretty expensive. I think you can buy them for like $75 on the internet now, but they used to be like $150, and 20 years ago, $150 was quite a bit. But anyways, what I was saying was I used to use a couple C-clamps, which is what people say is okay to do, and I would highly recommend not doing that. I did it a couple times and got away with it, and then one time what happened was, let me tighten this up just a little bit. As I was starting to release it, I'd compressed them and taken the snap ring loose, and then what happened is it will get caught. You can see the snap ring groove there. The retainer can get caught in the snap ring groove, and if you're going down when it gets caught, you're going to bend the retainer if you're using C-clamps or welding clamps. And when you're coming up, it'll get hung, and then if you jar it loose, then it's going to blow up in your face. So I finally, after about hurting myself, decided it was time to do something a little more safely, and I made this out of scrap iron like I do all my crap. And this is just some, like, I don't know what this is, 3/8 by 1.5 inch, 1.25 something like that. Flat iron, and the original plan was to drill a second set of holes down here for closer up action, but I never ended up needing it. Just like I had another set of holes for that to bring the drum on out for a bigger drum, but I don't think I've ever used those holes. I don't know. It does look like the paint's wore off of them, but the aftermarket ones, the way mine's made, it's a little bit slower because I have to just turn this nut to compress it. The aftermarket ones have a swivel here, and I'm sure a guy could figure out a way to do it, but a swivel there, and then you just got a T-handle up here so you can spin it, or you can put a nut on it, use a little cordless drill or impact, and do it a little bit more quickly. But honestly, you only got to do it 2 to 3 times per transmission, and sometimes slower is a little better. That way it doesn't get away from you. But I just made it out of square tubing and kind of made it from the pictures. You can tell my welding was pretty good back then. But I've done dozens and dozens of transmissions with this thing, and it just has never disappointed me. And I thought I'd pass it along, and like I just took some key stock and bent down there and welded to the end of the flat iron. And I'm doing a little AOD for my father-in-law's car right now, and just dug her out and dusted off, and she's back in business again. I do 2 or 3 transmissions a year. I used to do a few more, but they're just too big of a hassle. If you ever have a problem with a customer transmission, then you lose money on them real quick. So I just kind of do my own stuff and some stuff for family and close friends. But like I said, there's nothing to it. Just it's kind of like my cylinder head stands I made out of that square tubing. It just needs a jam bolt there, so that's adjustable, and then that's just some 1/2 inch all thread. And then I welded a nut to the flat bar, then drilled a hole with flat iron, and there's nothing to it. The main thing is finding a couple pieces of tubing that will slide over each other and fit halfway decent. And then I don't have my dimensions on me handy, but you can kind of just look at well, I'll tell you what, I'll grab a tape real quick. Just a second. All right, so dimension-wise, what I've got from the center of looks like about 7.5 inches from the center of the upright to the edge of the angle iron. And it's just 2 pieces of angle iron laying in there so I can clamp on it. And I got a piece of the big tubing over the little tubing just to increase the spacing on that for a bigger shaft. And then my outside hole looks like about 6 inches center to center, and then my inside hole that I use most of the time is about 5 inches. This is actually like 6 6 1/4. And then overall height is from the platform to the top, it's about 16 inches, and it's done everything I've ever needed it to do, so I really have no complaints with it. These are long, so they can get down in a deeper drum. Again, I've never had an issue with it. It's pretty stable, it's safe. You could do something similar on a press safely. This is my homemade press I made a long time ago. But just something to where you have a controlled compression and release whenever you are holding that snap ring, or holding the retainer down to get the snap ring on and off is the main thing. Like I said, 1 for safety, and 2 so you don't screw up the retainer, because if you bend the retainer, I don't know, transmission stuff's just delicate, and you need to do the best you can. And as you're compressing this, you can kind of wiggle that and go a couple flats and then wiggle it and make sure you're not getting bound up in that snap ring groove. But that's what it'll hang up on and cause a problem with. And I don't have too many other. I made a few bushing drivers and stuff back then. I got a kit off of eBay one time. This is what I use 90% of the time, and then my small ones, this is just a Harbor Freight bushing kit. So usually between the two, I can get everything done. Also, caping chisels were a step in the right direction. It's a way to take a bushing, like if it's down in a blind hole, and you can slice it with the chisel and then get it knocked out of there. Sometimes you don't have enough of a lip to get a hold of them. Honestly, the bushings are probably the biggest hassle of rebuilding a transmission, and a lot of people don't put bushings in them. A lot of backyard mechanics, I should say. And honestly, I feel like that's where a lot of these hydraulic shift transmissions rely heavily on having correct oil pressure. And just like in an engine, if all your bearing clearances are loose, you're going to be hemorrhaging oil internally, and your oil pressure is not going to be where it's supposed to be. They rely entirely on oil for governor pressure, so your upshifts, your downshifts, all that stuff is pressure. So if your base pressure isn't there, then everything else is going to be off. That's one aspect where the newer electronic stuff to me is actually easier to rebuild, because when the computer tells it to shift, it shifts the solenoid and it shifts. It doesn't go off pressures, it goes off of speed sensors and load that the engine calculates. You know, these are going off hydraulic pressure, and the load's generally calculated or figured between a balance of either a modulator or a throttle valve, that's hooked to the carburetor, your kickdown cable, as people would call it. But it's a balance of all those pressures, and if you're hemorrhaging oil internally in the lubrication circuit, then your other circuits are going to feel the crunch from that as well. So it's why a lot of these old rebuilt transmissions they work, but they just ain't quite right. And a lot of times it's little things like that. Some stuff you just can't fix. I mean, there's going to be wear internally that you can't fix, but bushings are an easy and a cheap step in the right direction as far as I'm concerned for a halfway quality rebuild on them. But I always replace all the bushings, and then obviously the clutches, and a lot of servos have bonded pistons. Your older stuff doesn't, but like the AOD does, and 4L60Es and 700R4s, a lot of that stuff is bonded. So it's a good idea to replace them, because like these are just like the seals in the transmission, but you can't change the seal. So the seal's hard. So the only way to replace that seal is to replace this whole servo. So that's something to figure into your rebuild, and you'll end up more satisfied with it. These are a love-hate thing for me. I sort of enjoy working on them, and I sort of hate them. But anyways, they kind of turn into a basic tools thing too. Obviously, you need some transmission assembly gel. This is my favorite stuff to use. Some snap ring pliers are an absolute necessity. And as a general rule, if it's not going together, don't force it, because you're going to bend something. So I think that's the majority of what I wanted to say. I mostly just wanted to show off my spring compressor. So if you're still watching, then thanks for coming. This thing also makes a good workbench for drums that have shafts in them, just like this one. If you don't have a workbench with a hole in it, I do most of my work off of this thing. And you don't want to like drive bushings in on it, but it works great for that. So I wanted to pass that on too.